Welcome everyone. We'll get started shortly. Thanks for joining us. Get started shortly, everyone. Thanks for joining. All right, I think we're ready to get started. Okay, thank you all so much for being here. And thank you for joining us for our 2023 webinar, Navigating the Path, Journeying Through Participatory Grantmaking. I'm Charlene Seeley, and I'm the Senior Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. So before we begin our webinar, please take a moment to review some of the Zoom features so that you have an optimal experience with us today. And if you have any questions for our tech team during the webinar, you can feel free to use the chat function and message anyone with the name LGC Tech. All right, and they will assist you. Otherwise, if you have questions for our presenters, who I will talk about in a moment, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit your questions there. And if you come up with questions during the webinar, and if they're for someone specific, you can just name the person or say, like, this question is for so-and-so, because we'll take all of the Q&A questions at the end of the presentation, and we want to make sure we direct them to the right person. Okay, if you'd like to experience live captioning, you can use the closed caption or CC feature. In the toolbar at the bottom of your screen, you can select show subtitles, and you'll get your closed captioning. Okay. So community-led grantmaking has taken on many forms for several years. And most recently, participatory grantmaking has become a popular term to capture this responsive style of funding. It speaks to a progressive strategy where funders take the passenger seat role and communities take the wheel. And in consideration of this, Grantmakers in the Arts hosted a dialogue-style webinar actually last year on participatory grantmaking, and we'll drop the link to that in the chat so that you can refer to it later or visit our website. And we discussed and addressed power sharing, new and equitable grantmaking practices for community-based organizations, and the challenges that exist with giving away funding. So we're continuing this rich conversation to go deeper, to discuss some of the challenges that arise along the way and share new models of decision-making that elevate community voices. And so to have this discussion, I am so glad to introduce Adam Fong, Program Officer for the Performing Arts at the Hewlett Foundation, and Shaunda McDill, Managing Director for Pittsburgh Public Theater. And we have our moderator, Lucas Grindley, Executive Director of Next City. And so Lucas is the former president of Pride Media and oversaw the leading LGBTQ brands Out Magazine, Pride, Out Traveler, Plus Magazine, and The Advocate, where he was editor-in-chief. And Grindley is an award-winning journalist. In both 2016 and 2018, NLGJA, all of the acronyms, named him as LGBTQ Journalist of the Year. So we are amongst a very important, talented, brilliant, accomplished facilitator, moderator for today. So without further ado, I'm going to kick it over to you, Lucas, to facilitate our conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Sherilyn. Thanks for the intro, and thanks to Grantmakers in the Arts for bringing us all together. We do have a great group of people, and I really do recommend going back and watching that YouTube video of the last moderated panel. I've watched it, and a lot of the questions that we're going to talk about today are inspired by what happened in that discussion, which was led by Vu, who is awesome, and I'm a great admirer. So the last discussion had been about power sharing and why we need to increase power and change, increase access to power and change who has power, because oftentimes people in philanthropy are trying to solve problems that they have never experienced themselves, right? And we're looking at power sharing as participatory decision making, and what does that look like? So we talked about participatory decision making as everything from giving up your own vote in what the outcome is to things that are already happening, like focus grouping or community listening, everything along that sort of scale. And I guess the conversation last time was a lot about why we should be doing participatory grant making. And today the conversation is titled Navigating the Path, Journeying Through Participatory Grant Making. So we don't want a philanthropy that's talking a big game, but not walking the walk. So I'm Lucas Grindley. I'm the executive director of Next City. I also host our podcast. So a little plug for the podcast. We're only about solutions that make cities more equitable. If you're trying to make cities more equitable, philanthropy is a huge part of the power over what's going to happen afterward. So we have an amazing group of people, starting with Adam Fong, who is the program officer for the Performing Arts program at the Hewlett Foundation. And I'll ask Adam to come on and introduce himself, and then we'll go to the next panelist.
Great, thank you. I think I need some help getting my video going, but I'll go ahead and start introducing myself. Okay, thank you for help with that. As Sherilyn mentioned, my name is Adam Fong. I'm a program officer in the Performing Arts program at the Hewlett Foundation. To describe myself, I'm a middle-aged Asian man wearing a green shirt, close-cropped hair, and I'm calling in from the Sunset District of San Francisco, the unceded homeland of Ramaytush Ohlone people. My background is as a musician. I'm still an active performer and composer, and I've been at the Hewlett Foundation for about 5 years now. Before that, worked in the San Francisco Bay Area music community. So in terms of participatory grant making, I'll just say really briefly that coming from within the community that we are trying to support is an ongoing exercise in humility. And I think that theme will probably come out a lot today. So in our work at the foundation, as we try to support Bay Area communities, honoring and supporting their own and each other's artistic and cultural vibrancy, we often come up against the limits of what we as individuals know and have experienced, as Lucas said. And this is where relying on the expertise, the wisdom, the knowledge, the ability, and the agency of the people who we're trying to benefit is essential. I mean, I think we should talk a little bit about what does belong in the participatory grant making definition. And I think we can maybe break down a little bit today where participation is really essential, is playing an important structural role, is changing systemic dynamics, and where it's maybe just helping, advising, doing other important functions, but possibly not playing an essential role in the work that we do. So I'm going to keep it brief there, and I know we'll get into more specifics. I'm really looking into talking about more specifics. And just as a little teaser, wanted to share this graphic that I found very helpful in our participatory work. This was passed to us through the hands of Arabella Advisors, but was originally published by Grantcraft. And each of these little donuts that you're seeing on the control board here, the circles, show different stages of how we might typically lay out a grant-making process. And I think what this graphic is trying to display is really there's a lot of decisions that we make as grant makers. Everything, in our institution, from devising a strategy to outlining who we think the beneficiary should be, what our approach might be, how we're going to solicit proposals, what our priorities are going to be, and selecting from amongst those proposals, all these different stages at which we have the opportunity to structurally cede power, hand off power, share power. And we have to make these judgments about where is the best use of our own time and resources, where is the best use of the time and resources of our partners in the work. So when we get into more specific programs, I can talk about some of the work we've done. But I would say Historically, our program has leveraged participatory practices through evaluation and through advice. And we are increasingly interested in exploring where along these grant making processes, more participation, more community leadership, and more agency of the individuals we're trying to benefit can improve and strengthen our work. So I'll leave it there and hand it back to Lucas and to Shaunda.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, an ongoing exercise in humility has been your experience so far. That's great. We're going to go over to Shaunda McDill, who is right now the Managing Director of Pittsburgh Public Theater, but had been a program officer for arts and culture with the Heinz Endowments for a long time. Welcome, Shaunda.
Thank you, Lucas. It's really great to be here. I want to thank the GIA team. My name is Shaunda McDill. I'm a Black woman. I have locks that are up in a ponytail, some gold specks and red lipstick. I'm about, caramel, a little darker than caramel complected right now. And I join you from the O'Reilly Theater in Pittsburgh on the unceded land of the Seneca Nation. And want to just really challenge everyone today to remind themselves that they and those that they serve are made of the stuff of stars, that there is so much excellence to be explored in the world of arts and culture. And we have the opportunity to do that. And this is why I'm starting with this slide of the James Webb camera. For those who've seen the documentary on Netflix about NASA's exploration, it's kind of a theme that you'll find for me throughout today. Want to say that, part of my experience is unique because I was in the foundation world, as Lucas mentioned, at one of the largest funding institutions for arts and culture here in the region. And then also started my own theater collective called Damascus Theater Collective that has been funded. That's actually how I got in contact with the foundations initially. And also now work at one of the larger nonprofits in downtown Pittsburgh, the Public Theater, that is not a Black-led institution. So I have a perspective from leading a Black-led institution, from being a part of one of the more institutional organizations in Pittsburgh, and then also working as the program officer for the public before I arrived and agreed to take this position. What I would offer as we remind ourselves of who we are and who we fund and all of the things that we have to explore together is also this quote from Audre Lorde on the Litany for Survival. I take it very seriously that oftentimes, because of power dynamics, people don't speak their truth. They are afraid that funding will be cut, that relationships will be broken if they say the thing that they want to say. But I would encourage you today to speak your truth as program officers, maybe the complexities, the fears. Sometimes we, think we have to present in a certain way among our colleagues as well, but maybe we can have this space as a safe space to remember that we must always speak up because it was never meant for us to survive. We are not here as eternal beings. So I don't mean to be super ethereal. I just want to be clear that I hope that we can have some authentic conversation and think of some ways forward for our industry, particularly in the world of theater right now when we struggle with the crisis we're facing. I am originally from Long Island, just to tell you a little bit about myself personally. I'm originally from Long Island. That is literally the street I grew up on and the lights that would come on that I had to come in. I went to Friends Academy, Dartmouth College, and the David Geffen School of Drama. It's my educational background. I've worked at theater companies across the country in various ways, moved to Pittsburgh to work at the August Wilson African American Cultural Center. That's how I got here, from a mentor, Shea Wafer, and have had the pleasure of meeting tons of people throughout my time in these various organizations and learned so much from so many in different communities. I'll end my introduction by saying one of the things that I learned and took away from philanthropy was a slide that I shared at one of my last board meetings. Was that in many ways, the organization that we serve here, it was the Heinz Endowments for me, but for you and your organization, you are the sun, right? And that's not meant to be in an egotistical way or to say that you are the center of the universe. But for many organizations, our foundations are the center of their universe. They spend their time thinking about how they can please us, what they want to say, what the consequences are going to be, and how they can get to the funds that you are distributing in order to accomplish their purpose. And oftentimes we don't realize there's already a structure, a system in place. And even if we acknowledge it, we don't actually realize how difficult it is or what we expect. So what I posited for my colleagues was, we are the sun. There are institutions that are close to us that receive the primary resource that we have, right? They receive the most of our energy, the most of our time. And then there are other institutions that are way out here beyond these asteroid belts. And those tend to be culturally specific, and they tend to be maybe LGBTQIA, and they tend to be smaller and sometimes even mid-size. And then somewhere in the middle, we give out all this project support because we don't really think about the longevity of some of those institutions. And then you have these things like COVID-19 that happened that kind of change the atmosphere. And then we change everything that's going on or shift our system to address it because of the emergency and the damage it might cause. And so I just would encourage you to think about the system you're in, and I'm really excited about the ways that we can maybe talk about our environments and a way forward, not just in the context of crisis, but in the context of becoming and serving and living with purpose in an equitable way that serves the highest and best use for all of our lives. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. We should all think about the system that we're in. I appreciate that. So we're going to start out, before we dive more in with our panelists, to ask you all a question. So we're going to ask the poll to come up on screen. Everyone will answer it. The questions are you currently practicing participatory grant making? Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. But if you are, answer the second question. Are you trying to increase your participatory grant making practice? And then we'll get a sense for everybody who's here. We have over 70 people here with us right now, and probably even more who will review the recording later. Hosts and panelists can't vote, so I'm sorry, but you're going to get plenty of time to answer this question. We'll give it another minute, and then I'll wait for the tech folks to tell me that we can actually put the answer up. And if you want to elaborate it all in the chat on your answer, because you don't think yes or no is enough, have at it. All right, are we ready to put up the results? Looks like we've got most answers in. All right, the results are up. So are you currently practicing participatory grant making? Yes, 62% of you are. That's wonderful. 23% no, 15% not sure. I mean, I'd love to hear more about that in the chat. Not sure if we are. And then 2%, question number 2, if you are working on participatory grant making, do you want to do more? 77% say yes. So people are highly interested in learning about what we have to say today. And we will get to trying to figure out, are you or are you not in participatory grant making? Maybe we can help with that. You figure that out by the end of this webinar. So we're going to stick with Shaunda for a bit, and we're going to answer this first question, which is just, if you could tell us a little bit about your connection to participatory grant making right now, like how has it been a part of your work? And we'll have you answer, and then we'll go to Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly enough, I'm going to offer that I think that even though I'm at a nonprofit working in theater, I still do participatory grant making, and I'll say it in this way. One of the challenges when we came, of course, is we're facing a structural deficit here. We needed to find some ways to have new revenue at the public. And from my time in philanthropy, one of the things I used to always hear from small, mid-sized, culturally specific organizations were, and when I say, let me be very specific, Black-led organizations, because I think all organizations are culturally specific in some way. But the Black-led organizations that I was working with in particular would say, we don't have space. There's a hoarding of space downtown. We can't find a space to rehearse or to do our shows or anything. And so one of the things I wanted to do immediately when I was here was to work with groups to do a collective grant where they could underwrite the cost of renting the public and their labor costs to participate and be in the public as their main stage place for performance and rehearsals. So it was a way of saying, how do I like work with the groups? They're already doing what they're doing, but they don't have a home. They shouldn't have to pay more in order to be here in this space. We can't afford to necessarily just open the doors and have people come for free, but how can the foundations help to support this collaborative effort, give space for them, and do it in a way that doesn't just benefit the public in a dynamic where then we hold the money and the power. So grant it to them, give them what they need, and then they can choose to spend it with us if they want to rent. So for me, that is still a way of thinking in a participatory way, even from the seat that I'm in, even though I'm not in a foundation any longer. And yeah, I think that's the answer in terms of how I do it now. Do you want me to speak a little bit about what I've done in terms of programs? Because I can.
Yeah, I'd love to hear that. I think that would be helpful for folks, what you did at now.
Okay,
And if you
awesome.
have slides, that's great too.
Yes, I do have some slides, so we can, whenever the excellent team of GIA gets a chance, we can pull them up and go through them. But I will start by saying there are two initiatives I'll speak about in particular that I worked on during my tenure. And one was the Ignite program. So part of my work was around something called the Small Arts Initiative, right? It started in '95 when the NEA had cut a lot of money, and Hines was like, how do we fund small arts organizations and make sure that they can stay intact and provide some money? So that became a strategic goal. After a while, that program, and when I started in philanthropy about 6 years ago, it was dated. It hadn't been changed since '95. Which meant, I think if any of us are in programs that haven't changed in over a decade, you should be like, what pieces of this program need to change? Because certainly the world has evolved. And so I brought together not only, some students from the D School, from Harvard University, a consultant agency called People Rocket, which was amazing, and the staff of the Hines Endowments. I incorporated colleagues as a kind of focus group and survey group in the experiments that we did, so that I could get a cross sector of opinions, even in terms of the colleagues in my office. We also went to community. So as we all do, held a series, and this was during COVID. So we were on calls, multiple opportunities to bring communities together. And I was very deliberate about making the diversity in the work look very different than what the portfolio itself looked like. The portfolio probably, even though it was the most diverse of our funding streams, it added what we used to say as texture to our overall portfolio. It was equivalent to one grant to one large institution. So one large institution's operating support was the equivalent to the amount of money I had to service all small arts organizations in the region, just for context. And we came up with Ignite. And the real goal of this was to provide equitable access to funding, to provide a safe space, take risks, and be innovative. I wish I could say that the program launched, but it did not. When we came back and presented, even though we had done almost a year and a half, it started during COVID, and we did a proposal for the program maybe 2 years later. The foundation decided not to launch it, feeling as though it was too focused maybe on just BIPOC organizations, that it wasn't kind of taking into account some other groups that then wouldn't be funded or wouldn't be prioritized. There was a challenge with some of the language around liberatory funding. There was a notion that let's give one large grant out the gate. What would it look like to give $150,000 to a group we're not in relationship with? So there were some aspects of it that were unique and different. And I'll move on to the Pittsburgh Cultural Treasures Initiative. Of course, this began with the work of Darren Walker and the Ford Foundation. Pittsburgh was a partner city, and I led and helped to create the Pittsburgh Cultural Treasures Program, which was a project in cooperation with the Ford Foundation, the Hines Endowments, and the Poise Foundation. The initiative was meant to create immediate and deep investments in Black-led institutions to proclaim and promote the Black cultural sector and to be data-driven. as a part of that work, that was probably the most participatory work that I have done in the foundation world. We initially were going to just give 5 large grants to 5 institutions, money gone, 10 million out the door, and it's split between 5 organizations. And I was like, nope, can we create a steering committee? Can we put community? Can we have something on our website that allows community to acknowledge ancestors, places, people, and let them nominate what the cultural treasures are, right? Because are these the foundation's cultural treasures, or are these cultural treasures from people in community? Let them have a voice and determine it. So we had, it had multiple layers. It had a national press kind of part and component that is you can find online that highlights the organizations. We ended up awarding 16 organizations funding that ranged from $150,000 to $1 million. And I will say, we can go into detail later, that there was a struggle, and the top struggles dealt with identifying and who determined what Black-led meant. And the second struggle was who had final say about which organizations were the most important to be funded as part of this initiative, based on relationships that not only the foundation has, but the relationship and the opinion of community. Lastly, Advancing Black Arts in Pittsburgh initiative was one that I co-led with Celeste Smith, who was on the first participatory panel that was held by GIA. And we distributed funds to Black-led organizations and projects and individual artists through this program that started in the 80s between the Pittsburgh Foundation and the Heinz Endowments, that started as the Multicultural Initiative. And I will kind of just close by saying that that initiative, we'll come back to that, that initiative, while amazing, rejected 90% of its applicants every year. There was only funding for about 10% of the people who would apply. And we realized we needed probably 50 times the amount of money that we had in order to see real change that would be meaningful and sustainable in the Black community in Pittsburgh through our funding. So those are some of the programs that I think had some participatory elements.
Yeah, people in the chat are like average 10%. I have a lot of follow-up questions about these programs, but I promise we're going to go to Adam. So I want to hear from Adam, what does participatory grant making look like for you? How have you been part of it and part of your work?
Yeah, thank you. Just to react, Shaunda, to your story, so much of this is quite familiar. A lot of the motivations for us are similar. A lot of the pain points also similar. And I also love hearing, just want to highlight the duration of the work involved here. Understanding that this organizing isn't something that happens real quickly. And sometimes it requires decades to get to that point where the resources really start flowing and you can start to see some equitable distribution, right? So just love that. And I think that's really important context for the story that I would like to share also. I don't have lovely visuals, so I'll just talk through it, hopefully relatively quickly so we can get to the juicier stuff. But similar to what Shaunda said about the program changing, our habit at the Hewlett Foundation is to refresh our grant making strategies every so often, which means roughly every 5 to 7 years. So when I started at the foundation in 2019, we were at one of those moments. And in 2020, we launched our new strategy, which has a couple of different pillars, but basically we talk about our work benefiting 3 different types of groups, communities, artists, and youth. So our goal, when we talk about supporting communities and using the performing arts, our goal is that Bay Area communities discover, develop, and experience artistic and cultural practices that provide meaning, inspiration, and joy. So the important move, I think, for us in this shift was that we were centering particular communities and what they would find most relevant and meaningful to them. So in the Bay Area context, the challenge in front of us was that we knew historically that both our funding and the funding from many other philanthropic institutions, as well as public institutions, is extremely uneven in how it's divided across our region. So our challenge to ourselves was, hey, let's look at those places, those communities, those peoples we have historically not funded well, and see what we can do. What is the process that we need to go through to have a positive impact in these communities to help ensure that the power of the arts is honored, that their practices, they determine what those cultural practices are that receive investment, that their communities are uplifted through, the purpose that we're all in this for, that wonderful thing that happens when artists and communities are working in tandem, in symbiosis. The other important context, the working context for our foundation, we almost exclusively give general operating support and multi-year grants. So that has its pros and cons. And in this case, the pro is that we tend to make longer commitments. We make longer relationships. We really value that steadiness because we feel that's how we can make long-term change. But it also means that introducing new relationships is not in our wheelhouse. We are not hired to, go out and talk to 1,000 different people and really juggle all those balls. We're meant to hold strong partnerships, and that's sort of much more comfortable for us. So when we talk about implementing this new strategy, we realize we really need to learn how to work differently here if we're going to be effective in these communities. The next step for us was designing some projects, some specific projects where we could learn how to do that. Gives ourselves some budget, some time, work in teams, and really just see what it's going to take to implement our strategy effectively. So there were 2 different projects, and I want to highlight the one that I was more involved in, which ended up creating the Vallejo Arts Fund. So for several reasons, we chose to focus on the city of Vallejo, which is sort of a moderately sized city in the Bay Area. Historically, we'd had very few funding relationships in town. But we were well aware through some listening activities we'd done as part of our strategy refresh that there were many, many individual artists, a really vibrant arts and culture scene, and also lots of challenges in a very diverse city. So this seemed like a really great opportunity for us to hopefully put in some resources and have some positive impact, to learn about how to manage processes, and also to encounter some challenges that are going to be, frankly, very common as our region continues to change, and the economic impacts, both the ups and downs, influence how people live their lives. There's so many details I could go into about the Vallejo Arts Funds, but just a couple of key steps that I want to highlight. One was changing what we thought success would look like. So I think coming into this work, we understand that the activities of our sector are easy to see. And often that's the thing we go to. What is that beautiful show, that very happy artist, the audiences who are transformed? Those are simple things to look for in our work. But trying to go a step beyond that when we think about what is the purpose of supporting this work in communities, we went towards things like, what's the web of relationships look like in the community? And can we strengthen that through this work? How are resources being distributed in this community, and is it equitable? Are the people, especially the artists in this community, exercising their own agency? Do we see collective agency within this community? And so we moved to those things as goals because of our values around equity and justice, as well as self-determination. And that really shifted what the nature of the work was. We needed a lot of help. That's the other thing that I really want to highlight is, I think I mentioned it, we weren't necessarily hired to be community organizers, to be facilitators. Some of us have done some of that in our past, and that's really helpful. But I think we're hired because we can navigate these philanthropic systems. Like we have a foot in and a foot out, right? But that also means that maybe we're not the best at facilitating a community process with 40 people who don't like each other that much. That is not my strength. So being able to say that, to hire consultants who can help us with that, to steward that process, handle all the tricky stuff, that's really tough work. And they're very deserving of our support because that's the kind of work that leads to those goals that I mentioned. And then the final thing I'll say, the Vallejo Arts Fund has done a few rounds of grant making now, where the grant categories were designed by community members. The selections were made by community members. You can search that up on the web if you want to look at more details. But I think the important thing, the challenging thing that we're sitting with now as the foundation staff is, what's our long-term commitment to this style of work? And what role do we see ourselves playing? We can't just give money and disappear. Like, that does not feel like a responsible thing to do if we are truly looking to impact this community over the long term in a positive way that fits with our goals. So it requires this constant assessment of who we are, what we think we can offer, and being open to how the community members themselves would answer that question. Do they care about us? Do they even want our money? Do they want us to show up in their neighborhood and help out? And what do they think we have to offer? So participatory grant making to me is all about living through those processes, continuing to ask ourselves those questions, and to, you know, really take it seriously that, like, these people are not only the people we're trying to benefit, the way we do it is important, and how essential they are to our process is where we need to exert some rigor to avoid tokenism, to avoid pandering, to avoid flip-flopping, because everyone's going to tell you a different thing about what they need.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction of both of those. So I'll answer the question a little bit quickly, which is that I'm part of two participatory grant making processes. One I'm in right now with the Hewlett Foundation, where they haven't talked a lot about it yet publicly, but there will be more information, I'm sure, from different places, where we just last week, I think it was, gathered in Chicago for our consensus building meeting, and we came to consensus around a project, very exciting. And now the project begins, and this keeps going. And before that, much more simple process with a group called the Neil Pierce Foundation, which supports solutions journalism about equitable cities. And they just looked around and they said, well, who are journalists who work in this space? Let's let them decide who gives this money away for travel grants for other journalists to go and report on a story, right? Whereas it was strange in the Hewlett Foundation one, there's no grant applications. There's the people who were selected were existing grantees from this Inclusive Economies program. So it was like, well, we're just looking around the room, we're saying, well, which of the Inclusive Economies program grantees want to be part of this learning cohort process? And we raise our hands and we join. It's interesting, Adam, that you say that, you know, this was an area where the foundation had identified maybe people had been underserved in Vallejo, right? And you're like, well, participatory grant making can help us better serve this group of people who we've maybe overlooked or maybe underserved in some way. Feel free to correct me if I'm misstating or overstating anything here, but it's interesting that then you had to go out and find people to take part in a process and represent the people of Vallejo and their interest in arts and culture more broadly. How do you kind of overcome even just that barrier of not having a long relationship or immediately obvious, you know, cohort of people to pick from to join this program?
Yeah, that's it's a tough question. And I think the hardest part of that, I mean, there's some basics, right? Like, start small, I think, is the first basic. You can only talk to one person at a time if you actually want to have a candid conversation, is a part of what we learned. So part of our method was to just start where we could. Who do we know? Like, who are the individual artists who are willing to talk with us? And, you know, can we talk with them, have a good, deep conversation, compensate them for their time, and ask them who else we should talk to. So a little bit of that snowball effect helped us get the ball rolling. Also, you know, taking some risk, like being willing to, I referenced this listening session we did as part of our strategy refresh. And that was great. And also, I think we messed up. Like, it was great for us to make that effort. But I think because we were so new to the community, we didn't know how to attend to all of the things that that listening session implied. So I think people felt heard. I think people were glad to have the opportunity to be in touch with us. But, you know, we couldn't move really fast because we were in a strategy refresh process. And I don't know that we actually expressed that clearly enough, nor did we really stay in touch enough after that. So there was a long pause where we didn't follow up on the things that people told us. And that was the mistake that I think we actually had to remedy. So that's where I just want to say, like, sometimes you're going to mess up, but you have to be willing to take these risks in order to start building those relationships, right? And then I think the final thing is, you know, trying to understand as much as possible the context that people are bringing into the conversation. And not only just hearing a couple of stories, but doing enough of that due diligence where we could start to see patterns was really important. Some of them were really simple patterns, like, what's your experience with philanthropy, and you know, what pattern should we avoid? Just asking it straight out. And people told us, like, funders always come, they always want to know what we need, and then they always disappear. Or we got together collectively and we raised money, and then the existing power structure here in town took it over, and we felt like our voice was used and we didn't see the benefit. So, you know, I think sometimes, and I definitely felt this when I was an individual artist or running my own organization, the people who are in bigger institutions figure that those who are not in those institutions aren't tracking all the stuff that's going on. But we are. I mean, I know people are. I know people are watching real closely, and they understand how things are moving, especially the people who are excluded. They understand those dynamics extremely well. So just being able to talk about them openly, to sort of crack open that nut and be willing to discuss, like, okay, what's happened to you? Please explain how that's impacting you and your community. And, you know, are you willing to work with us to try to not only avoid those things, but find a better way to be true partners together? I think those have been the keys for us. Not to say that we're doing a particularly great job, but I think we're doing a better job than before, at least, or trying to fail fast enough that we can learn from it and keep moving.
Now you're pointing out important dynamic, which is participatory grant making exists in part because there have been mistakes made in the past, and then maybe lack of trust with the communities that are taking part in the participatory grant making, right? So in Pittsburgh, from 2003 to 2017, the people were awarded, generally from private grant making, $318 million. And of that, 86% went to white-led organizations. This is according to the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council, and was reported recently in Inside Philanthropy. And the story that's about the program we were talking about, Shaunda, Pittsburgh's Cultural Treasures. And I guess as part of that, you know, first step was there wasn't even a list of people or a list of organizations that were Black-led, right? So you had to put together this list of 160 Black-led groups. The list originally was very small, right? So what does that process look like of even identifying these people who were underserved, overlooked, and then also, saying, hey, do you want to participate in this process that has resulted previously in 86% of money going to white-led organizations?
Yeah. One, it looked like just scouring every piece of information we had in our system, right? Like, what groups do we traditionally fund? Then when we looked at, you know, the groups that we traditionally fund, and I say that that's one, like, underneath that layer, and it's something all of us need to consider, is how are you tagging your grants? You know, how are you, in whatever system you're using, how are you codifying things so that when these moments come, how do you call the information? We all know this, I'm just reiterating the importance, right? And also the difference in what you're coding as something, and is there agreement on your team? So secondarily, I just emailed all my colleagues, right? So I emailed everyone, I emailed the Opportunity Fund, Allegheny Regional Asset District, the Pittsburgh Foundation. I was like, can we all just share our lists? Any Black-led organization that you have, can you send it to me? I will do the work to compile it all, and then I'll send it back to you. So you have it on file, so we can stop saying that we don't know who these people are, that we don't know where they live, that we don't know if they exist. Like, we can stop all of that, because I'm willing to do the work right now to do that. And while I acknowledge that's not fully what I was hired for, it isn't a part of the job, to Adam's point, sometimes you have to do the thing that's necessary because it doesn't exist in the system as it exists in a way of working that is beneficial to you getting to the end that you want to see happen. So I even called PA Council on the Arts. Like, I called everybody that I knew did this work. And then we ended up with a list of about 160 Black-led organizations from 24. And what I will also mention, to allow for another question or secondary so we can advance, is just that once we brought that list together, there really was a question on the institutional side of what do we mean by Black-led arts and culture organizations? Because often we say arts and culture. What we found is that, you know, in particularly from the organizations working from the African diaspora and in Black culture, they were not a traditional performing arts organization. So if they did not perform, even though some of the Black-led organizations were performing to all white audiences, so this is a whole other conversation, they were not considered a cultural organization or arts organization in terms of some of the definitions we held, because they didn't have a formal season. They were not presenting to that traditional white audience. Maybe they only did balls. Maybe they were a group and they did do some sort of cultural artistic event, but it was a ball and it was to their community. That for me still qualified as an arts and cultural organization. Like, that is what we're talking about. But I think, again, this conversation around definitions and terms and who are you looking for when you're looking can't be overlooked when you talk about creating a list, is all I want to add with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting you pointed that, it's not fully what you were hired for, but you decided you'd step up and do this. And then Adam pointed out, like, we're not hired to be community organizers usually, but that's what's going on, right? And one thing that came up during that last panel hosted by GIA was, what is the job of a program officer when the goal is facilitating participatory grant making, right? This traditional role that we've had, how does it have to change? And one of the guests, Jeffrey Banks, was a program officer with MacArthur Foundation, said that his job was no longer the gatekeeper role, which he had traditionally played, and his job had changed from a culture of advocacy where he's sort of saying, please support my recommendation to the board or to the president of the foundation. And instead his role was to engage community members, and so that they're in a position to make the recommendation instead of him. It's not subjective, right? So how do you see the role of a program officer who is in the middle of a participatory grant making process changing versus maybe what they are normally doing? And I'll start with you, Adam.
Yeah, this is a tough one, and I'm going to plead a little bit of ignorance here because this is the only grant making job I've had. I have interacted with lots of POs, but this is my first time actually doing it. So when people say traditional program officer role, I don't really know what that is or what people think that is. I can tell you that, and this may be particular to the Bay Area, but because there is so much newer wealth that is not as well institutionalized as what we experience in sort of the older foundation world, what I'm seeing is some challenge areas where I feel like in my role in a larger institution that has professional staff, the things that I can bring that are of unique value are really accessibility, transparency, and some level of accountability. And for participatory practice to succeed, I think all of those need to be ongoing discussions. How much of those things do participants want? Accessibility, transparency, accountability. And my fear, I will just say out loud, is that as a lot of money moves through less and less visible channels, I think we run the risk of losing ground on all of those avenues: accessibility, transparency, accountability. And so just to connect back also to the last webinar, I think they ended around some of the big questions about, why is there so much money moving through philanthropy? And are we, I think, just putting, new processes in to sort of cover for how much wealth is going through this system now? So without answering directly that question, I think that's why I'm leaning on our role as POs as being focused on these items that are really about, like, what is our relationship with community members we're trying to benefit? Do we want to be cloak and dagger and very mysterious and like not very accessible and, trust us and take our money? Do we want to be in process with people so that they feel they know what's going on? Do they care what's happening inside our institutions? Or Shaunda, you referenced some of this, like what the debates are and what the barriers are in our houses so that they can help us advocate. Like those things, we can't presume to know what people want, but I think this is where the discussion gets really meaty and interesting, is where we can talk with the community members themselves about, like, well, how much do you want to take on the joy and the burden of this grant making process?
That's right. As someone who's been in a process, it's like, well, I do have other things I need to do. So a reminder to the audience, if you have questions for the panelists, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to those in a few minutes. But the same question to you, Shaunda, how do you see the role of a program officer evolving, or even what skills do you need to have as a program officer involved in participatory grant making?
Well, having so many emotions, I want to say a couple of things which pertain to that, even if I don't have a direct answer. I mean, I got a job description. First of all, it's not my money. And I used to tell people all the time, it's not the Miles McDill fund. So I'm not necessarily making decisions around what I think should be. There are strategies in place. Hines was often thinking 10 years in advance. The fact that I stayed in philanthropy 5 years was 2 years past the time that program officers of color had statistically stayed in any institution, right? If you look at APFI's exit interview. So I was feeling like I've already beaten the odds and I'm still in the industry. But at some point, I think you have to say, and this is wherever I was, am I spending more time in my role defending the gap that exists between what we say we fund and what we're actually funding? Or am I spending more time distributing funds in a manner that is transformational, that may actually lead to this hoped for future that we proclaim in our vision statements? And so for me, when I felt like I was spending more time with the consternation and the defending of strategies that I don't think always presented the results that were in our missions and visions, it was like, this is no longer really a space for me. And if you ask where I worked previously, if they do participatory fund making, they would tell you, no, we do not do that. That is not. So I already know I was posing a challenge in the system because it wasn't something, even with the long history of directing some of those funds, as you stated, those glaring numbers and statistics earlier, Lucas, it was not something that was seen as a part of the way in which we worked, but it was fully how I work. And so it became a little bit of a rub. And I want to say, not for the board, right? Sometimes we make like the boards are terrible. They're all these old white men and they are the ones, or this. The board approved the program. And I want to state that I went to the board, we presented it, it was approved and had funding. I think there was an internal management, like there was a culture that I think prevented it from moving forward that had nothing to do with the approval from, even in my case, the family or the institution. Now, what goes on behind closed doors, I don't know, but I think that I just want to be clear that program officers are not like these robots. Like all of us on this call are people who have fundamental beliefs, and sometimes right is just right. And if you're we didn't have a problem when COVID came, stopping the world and putting out money, and we did it through ACH, and we bent our rules, and we didn't ask for reports, and we got it out the door. But then when COVID was over and we were back, we put all those rules back in place and stipulations, and we put all those things on the dashboard again that I saw, and all these questions, that we have to ask that Adam mentioned. And for me, it just came to a point where, while I'm not of the school and the state of mind that you just take money and throw it out the door, I also am of the mindset that I'm of the mindset that there is a form of participatory grant making happening for those who already have power. And that needs to shift, the audience needs to change, and the process needs to become less difficult for those who are applying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to go to this question over who does make the final decision. Like you mentioned, the board did approve the program, and in the end, the board's going to approve the grants, right? And in the situation with Hines, for example, what does it mean that Hines reserved the right to make the final choices about grant winners and amounts? Was that just like it's a check the box thing, or was it a thing that was sort of prominent in the conversation that the community members were having about who should get which grants, or how did it create any sort of trust dynamic as to, well, you want our information, but you're not really going to let us make this decision? And then I'll go to the same question to you afterward, Adam, about what happened in Vallejo, because you said that they did make the decision, but I don't know if that necessarily means if it comes with caveats or anything, but we'll start with Shaunda.
Yeah. I will try to be succinct. So the first thing is, in the process, there were 3 stages that I created, knowing that these power dynamics existed. So once we were able to broaden the program to say, we're not going to select 5 groups to give $10 million to, we're going to broaden it. Then it was like, step 1 will be large awards that Hines will have the final say on. Step 2 will be capacity building. We didn't even some people like that, some people hate it. But anyway, step 2 will be multi-year funding for another group of organizations that are not the favorites. Because 9 times out of 10, if you're handing out large sums of money in round 1, it's going to people you already know and trust, not to people you don't know. So round 2, new people. Round 3 was money we didn't define. Let's leave $1 million for what we learned, and let's make sure we give it to people who wouldn't normally give it into communities, and let's figure out what we learn and how we build a relationship, and then have some money left. Because usually we get to the process, we learn stuff, and then there's no money left. So that was kind of how the structure was built. What I will say is there was great consternation. So even though at the end of the day, the steering committee and I knew that Hines had the final say, for instance, in this process. Totally honest, totally above board. I think the thought was if 95% of the people on the call are Black people in community, and they're telling you this is what Black means to us, this is who we identify as Black-led organizations. There's groups on your list that we don't even consider Black-led in our definition. You will come in an 8-month process to understand how we value things and elevate that above your own strategy and thinking. And when that didn't happen fully, because it did happen to some degree, the foundation bent, there were more organizations. We went from awarding 5 to 16. There was a difference in what significant funding meant. The foundation thought, oh, only significant funding is $1 million or more. Significant funding for some of these organizations that were 40 years old and had a $40,000 annual operating budget was $150,000, right? Which is sad, but true. So once we kind of went through that, we saw where philanthropy budged, but I think there was a deep hurt of but you don't even trust me to tell you what Black is, and I'm Black. Right. So it was what are we doing? Now we don't even want to come back to the process. And Shaunda, I told you when you called me, I didn't want to be a part of it, but I did it because I trust what you're doing. And what do you mean by experiment? What kind of experiment are y'all doing over there? Because I don't even like that word, right? These are the kind of conversations I was having. So I think if we're really honest and candid, in Pittsburgh, the communities were already not trusting, but they're not going to say that because even the little 10-20% has been allowing us to live. We're not talking about thriving, right? But so yeah, I will just pause there to say there was challenge, there was distrust. Different from Adam, I feel like I started embedded in it already and I knew it existed, but I had great hope that we would be able to ascend and forge new relationships between the community and foundation. And I do think it happened. I will say in closing, there was a document that was created almost like a promissory contractual community agreement around how the foundation would interact with the community moving forward. That one, there would be no kind of consequences to their honesty, that funding would not be prohibited based on someone speaking out. There were 3 or 4 items that the community said, well, now that we've been through this, we want to ask for this moving forward in working with the foundation. And are you willing to sign this agreement to say this is how you'll engage us in community, because this is how we want to be engaged. And so that was a win led by Justin Lang, who was on the committee. And so, yeah, hopefully I answered the question in that.
Yeah, no, I somewhat related in our own process. Folks needed to believe that they could be asked to join the participatory grant making process and say no without ramifications for their funding, right? Or to take part and be honest along the way that they needed to drop out because they just had taken on too many things, right? And the foundation allowed for that too. So there definitely had to be some amount of trust that we rely on you already for a lot. So I don't want to burn anything by not doing this participatory grant making process the right way, right? Yeah. Adam, same sort of question to you is, how did this, how much of the final decision really was up to the members of the cohort?
Yeah, thank you. My heart is aching, Shauna, just knowing that when you're playing that hinge role, you're bearing the brunt of a lot of that dissatisfaction, and it's your reputation, personal reputation on the line. So that's really tough. I think to that point, like the role that Shaunda described herself playing is something that we sought a partner for. So in Vallejo Arts Fund, the mechanics of how it worked was our foundation made a grant to a known grantee of ours, which is Center for Cultural Innovation. They house the fund with direction from community members and a paid facilitator to bring the recommendations from community to CCI. And so that structure has worked so far quite well for several reasons. Most importantly, it allows me and my colleagues from Hewlett to show up in the room, but have an arm's distance from any kind of approval process because we've already made the grant and the money is out the door. CCI, I think also in this case is really important because it's within their mission and purview to do this work supporting community, to empower community members to take that agency and determine how the funds are used. And they have some of the capacity building, orientation, offerings that people want and need. So, Shaunda mentioned that sometimes those programs are unpopular. I think that's always because they feel imposed, right? But for Center for Cultural Innovation, these are programs that they've been running. They're interested in doing more of it. They have a staff member who actually lives in the community. All these things really help out a lot and give us a lot more faith that we can allow those decisions to be made, and we can just keep our eye on that longer term goal of watching out for the community outcomes. So that's a really simple answer. And there's lots of other bodies of work where it's been far more complicated. But I think for us, the key has been knowing that we want community members to make those final decisions and finding the right partners who can enable that process.
Yeah. Can I just want to add, I just want to hop in and say, we did try to bring in an intermediary. And what I found was just like, it wasn't, that the work wasn't advancing maybe in the way that we had thought. And so, it sometimes happens.
And it's tricky, right? It requires all these handoffs that for us, we don't make grants real fast. And that's part of why we needed that. But we also don't write contracts real fast. So the timing around that is tricky. And we've learned a lot of, what we need to think about a little further in advance to make sure people don't get dropped along the way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll just mention that it happens to be CCI, Center for Cultural Innovation, who is the intermediary for the Certain Foundation between all the grantees, potential grantees, and our own cohort. We're going to head to questions from the audience, and to help make that happen, we have Sherilyn here. Here's Sherilyn.
All right. Thank you, Lucas, Adam, and Shaunda. That was fantastic. I love that you kind of brought in like the high level broad thinking, and there was also like a lot of nuts and bolts. And I think that that's really important for this kind of like second iteration of this conversation. So thank you for that. As Lucas just said, it is time for our Q&A. I see some questions have already come into the Q&A. So if you look to the bottom of your screen, see that Q&A box to send the questions in for our presenters. Be specific about who they're for. And I am just gonna start right now, and we can remove that image from the screen, that's live from the screen, and we'll dive in. Okay. So our first question reads, have any of you had experience participatory assessment, budgeting, or granting? Having the applicants decide on who gets funding rather than the peer assessment model. Okay, so I'm gonna drop this in the chat as well, just so you can kind of read it yourselves.
I'll start off just because I feel like the Pittsburgh Cultural Treasures process, one thing that happened, which was very interesting, was like the cohort and the steering committee agreeing that like, we don't want to be evaluated. We actually don't want, and the interesting thing was Ford didn't provide the money and asked for that, right? Margaret Morton, Rocio, they didn't say, you have to say all of these lists of complicated things in your report out about how the money impacted these organizations, because they realized the funds were going to groups that were generally excluded from large types of this type of investment. So Sherilyn, I think like for me, it wasn't a long period of time. And again, I now see the work as participatory. I didn't know it at the time, but what evolved during that process was, so one, steering committee did have the opportunity to participate in amounts and how they were redirected, even though it was still impacted. Two, they also had the opportunity to say, we don't want a traditional evaluation. We're tired of that. Can we engage a firm when we do this RFP? One, can we pay the groups who apply for their time? And then two, can we find a partner to come alongside us to even figure out what we want to ask? Maybe what we want to ask is the impact of this money in community, not just how well we did with the money as an organization. Maybe we want to talk about the impact of philanthropy on the process and how it might have been different if we were not being funded but had the money and did this. So there were these questions that they had that wouldn't have been a part of a traditional process, and I really found that to be intriguing. So my experience was that the sooner you involve people, the sooner the process and the questions change, and they become, in my opinion, a lot more interesting than a traditional study that may sit on a shelf somewhere with great statistics, but don't change the way you do your work in the future.
That's great. Thanks for that, Shaunda. Adam, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, just briefly to say, yes, participatory budgeting. One of the things we did with Vallejo, which we felt was really important, was just put the money on the table from the outset and say, here's how much we're investing, it's 500,000, and then to invite people to tell us what are the buckets in which you would like to see this invested. So that was a way not only to ask them to name priorities together, but also to allocate the funds. And we learned a lot through that process. Some people really hated it, actually, because they felt like it was, choosing between children kind of thing. And then also Vallejo is a city that itself has done participatory budgeting for a certain part of its municipal spending. And we heard about some of the problems with those processes, as well as some of the benefits. So I haven't done it myself, but I think it's really interesting because it invokes a lot of the same challenges around inclusion. Who has voice? To what extent does it reflect the existing structures and power dynamics in a place or a community?
That's great. And I'm dropping this in the chat. These are some Next City articles. I don't know, Lucas, if you also wanted to. Oh, say it again.
You beat me to it. I was definitely going to share those articles. Great. I just got a link.
Yeah, well, perfect. So if you want to respond, you have them here, so you can speak to them now because they're right in the chat. If there's anything you want to add now that folks have the resources.
Well, the other thing I would say is that, it's been pointed out in the previous webinar that participatory grant making isn't new as a concept. There's participatory processes have come up, and participatory decision making has existed in lots of different ways in lots of different places, but we get the greatest amount of interest from our readers in Next City in any sort of community engagement process, and especially participatory budgeting process, because democracy does not function correctly unless you actually have engagement with the citizenry, and that is more than just getting people to vote, which is obviously important, but it's like, how engaged are you in the government that is supposed to be serving you? And that's not just to blame the citizens and say, oh, well, they need more civics classes, they need to learn more. It's more, well, look at the government itself and say, well, is our process actually even welcoming? Do we actually even try to get people's input? And that can go beyond budgeting. It can go into what's our master plan, right? There's one story that I'll find and put in here that's about an organization called Civic Lex in Lexington that has really done a good job of modeling what it should look like to have a government that actually involves and engages people along the whole way. And Civic Lex is an organization that works outside the government to make the government better at that.
That's great. That's great. Thank you for that, Lucas. And I have kind of like a follow-up question based on some of the things that you mentioned, Shaunda and Adam. So Adam, you said one of your recommendations for folks who are doing participatory grant making is avoid flip-flopping, because like different questions will come up, different things will come up, like kind of like commit period. and then Shaunda, like you talked about like that first iteration of cultural treasures and how it was like only 10% of the folks who applied got the funding. Then like round two, it was like, okay, like we'll give 500 to all the people who applied. And then just now you mentioned like the sooner people get involved, the sooner the questions change. Like with participatory grant making, it is not just like a casual walk in the park. Like it's very involved. It's like you have to kind of stay on your toes and be thinking about like, okay, how can we prevent the flip-flopping, but also like be responsive to what the needs are. So what would you all offer in terms of like how people can do a good job of that? Like what should they prioritize? And Lucas, I also want to ask you to respond to this too, just with your position with CERDNA and Center for Cultural Innovation.
Oh, I'm gonna say this because out of respect for those who are still in the work, I feel like they may have some more robust answers. Because even just being gone in the last 6 months, it seems like an eternity being away. But what I will say is that one, we kind of are mixing programs. So in Advancing Black Arts, which was a grant fund program that was awarded twice a year, that's where we rejected such a high percentage. And that was a different kind of thing, but we did try to still be as participatory as possible. But even that really wasn't. We had panels, things like that. That was more of a structured system that was just targeted towards Black-led groups and organizations and individual artists. In PCTI, and I will drop a link to so people know who those groups were, but in that program, what I will say is I think I've made people tired because I've realized that in a system, you're trying to change on multiple levels. So the link that I dropped is a Medium site where we highlighted the 16 groups, but that was a grant that we provided to journalists, understanding that Black journalists weren't working. So I provided a grant to Pittsburgh Black Media Federation, who then engaged 16 Black journalists, each to pick a different cultural treasure to write a story on. So if you think about that level of trying to change the system and enrich and pay on multiple levels, right? Yes, our steering committee got paid. They got paid $250 per meeting. If it was a longer meeting, then they got paid more, but they were basically on a contract for a year where they were getting $1,500 per quarter for about 3 meetings. Because again, it was, investing in people and artists and making sure that the steering committee had artists on it and different people in community who were cultural workers who could use those funds. So all I will say is that because of a level of trust, I was able to build in multiple tiers of change in the process that felt challenging when I was no longer there for other people to manage, right? Because it was like, I don't think foundations are traditionally set up that way. It required more, and Adam has said this several times, it required more expedient answers often than we're able to give. It required quicker decisions in the short term than we're willing to make sometimes. And it required more iteration and prototyping than I think philanthropy can withstand sometimes. Because we usually are like, let's take our time, figure it out and that it will work, and then award the money. Instead of, let's put the money out there and then let's see what happens and put a little more and do something different and then do that, which to me feels like when there's such great need, particularly in a city like Pittsburgh, because of the level of poverty people are living in, particularly the Black community, I don't think people can wait sometimes for 5 years for us to figure out a strategy. Like they need the money tomorrow. And they're not going to tell us that their lights are being cut off or that they can't eat. They're not going to say that sometimes, but it is the reality of what's happening. And then sometimes we have this extra money left in philanthropy and we're like, oh, we'll push that to next year's budget. We're not going to spend it all, right? And that is a whole other conversation, but yeah.
Before you chime in, Adam, if you were planning on it, I want to acknowledge it is 15 minutes past the hour. If folks have to drop off, just know this conversation is being recorded, as you can see. And we'll send out the slides. We are sending out the contact information of the presenter. So if any questions that you have or you want to ask them, you can reach out to them directly. They gave us permission, so no worries. But if Adam and Lucas, you want to take some time to respond very quickly before we drop off.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just say my final word in response to this question. It's a great question. And I think it requires reflection so that you can tell people as an individual and as an institution, what are you committed to? That's how you avoid flip-flopping, right? Is having something you're committed to. And it may not be in the language that people want it to be in. It may not be at the time scale that they want, but as long as you're making an honest commitment, I think then you can be trusted, even if it means you have to say no a lot of times. At least people know you're being honest with them.
Yep. That's great.
I mean, in terms of commitment, that people were paid for their time in our cohort. One thing that's unusual about it is that there did come a moment in the cohort where we knew we had to do more work, and the members of the cohort had a facilitated conversation to discuss what that work would look like, so that then people could recommit, right? Or not. Like they could decide that they were going to stay in, or that this was the time that they were going to drop out. And there was more than one time where people could recommit or drop out. And that was very helpful.
That's great. I love the flexibility there. Well, I have like 5 more questions, but of course we're over time. So I will thank you all once again for being here today, sharing some of your insights. Some of them are like, it takes vulnerability, I think, to share a like new level of depth when having these types of conversations. So I just want to say thank you again, Shaunda, Adam, and Lucas, for participating in this webinar today with us. And for those of you who are here still with us, thank you for joining. We are going to be dropping a survey in the chat. So please take the survey and let us know what you think. There it is. Once again, the conversation has been recorded, so we'll send that out. We'll send the slides out, and the contact information of our presenters will be on the final slide. If you have any questions about this webinar or future programming, reach out to me. I'm Sherilyn Seeley. And once again, thank you so much for joining today. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you, thank you, thank you.